Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The content provided in this video is for educational and historical entertainment purposes only. It explores the intersection of American art history, cultural sociology, and the historical evolution of domestic law. This presentation does not constitute legal advice, financial counseling, or professional career guidance. The historical trends and case studies discussed herein are reflective of past societal norms and should not be used as a substitute for modern legal counsel. Viewers are strongly advised to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal professionals regarding any personal matters related to family law or domestic relations. Imagine standing in front of a massive oil-on-canvas portrait from the mid-1800s. A prominent American statesman sits in his study, surrounded by the trappings of power: leather-bound books, a globe, and a heavy velvet curtain. But if you look closely at the shadows behind his left shoulder, there is a strange, ghostly blur in the paint. For decades, art historians ignored this smudge, dismissing it as a technical flaw or age-related decay. However, recent X-ray analysis reveals something chilling. That blur was once a woman. It was the man's wife, meticulously painted into the original composition and then systematically scrubbed out, layer by layer, after a scandalous and rare legislative divorce. This is not just a story of a broken marriage. It is a literal erasure of a human being from the visual record of American history. In an era where divorce was a legal impossibility for most and a social death sentence for all, the American man used art as his final court of appeals. He didn't just leave his wife. He used the canvas to rewrite his own reality, effectively divorcing his past through the power of the brush. Today, we are peeling back the varnish on these hidden histories to understand how the American male's experience of separation, custody, and social ruin has been coded into our nation's greatest masterpieces. This masterclass is designed to solve a specific problem for the modern observer: the inability to see the hidden power dynamics that still influence our views on masculinity and domesticity today. By the end of this 10-part series, you will possess the visual literacy to identify the signs of the split in American portraiture and genre painting. You will understand how historical trends in the law directly dictated the aesthetics of the American home and art, and why the lonely man trope in modern media has its roots in the strict Victorian codes of the 19th century. We are moving beyond the surface level to show you how art was used as a weapon, a shield, and a ledger for men navigating the most tumultuous transitions of their lives. To understand the evolution of divorce for men in U.S. art history, we must first look at the colonial and early republic periods, roughly from 1750 to 1820. During this time, the concept of a divorce as we understand it today, a civil dissolution of a contract, barely existed. In the eyes of the law, under the English common law doctrine of coverture, a husband and wife were considered a single legal entity, and that entity was the husband. Because of this, a man could not easily divorce, because he would essentially be trying to sever a limb from his own legal body. This legal reality created a fascinating phenomenon in American portraiture, known as the succession of silence. In the late 18th century, a wealthy American merchant or landowner would typically commission a conversation piece, a type of painting that showed the family unit in a domestic setting. These paintings were symbols of stability, lineage, and patriarchal control. However, when a marriage failed through informal separation, since formal divorce often required a literal act of the state legislature, the visual evidence of that failure had to be managed. We see this in the sudden shift toward the solitary patriarch portrait. In these works, men who were known to be separated from their spouses were painted in vast, empty landscapes or isolated studies. The absence of the wife was not just a lack of presence, it was a loud visual statement of legal and social independence. Take, for example, the case studies of portraits from the Federalist era. When a man's domestic life collapsed, he often commissioned a portrait that emphasized his civic duty over his private life. The problem of the missing wife was solved by replacing her with symbols of the Republic. Instead of a spouse at his side, he would be depicted holding the Constitution or standing next to a bust of George Washington. This was a strategic move. By aligning himself with the permanence of the state, the man was visually compensating for the instability of his home. The depth of this symbolism cannot be overstated. For a man in 1800, a portrait was his LinkedIn, his Instagram, and his legal deposition all in one. If he could project an image of stoic solitary strength, he could mitigate the potential outcomes of social ostracization that followed a domestic split. As we move into the mid-19th century, the fault system of divorce began to take root in various states. This required a man to prove a specific wrong committed by his spouse, such as adultery or desertion, to gain a legal separation. This shift in the law led to a dramatic change in genre painting, which are scenes of everyday life. We began to see the emergence of the abandoned husband motif. Unlike the earlier portraits of strength, these paintings were often designed to elicit sympathy. We see men depicted in messy interiors, perhaps sitting at a kitchen table with a broken plate or a neglected child, looking wistfully at a silhouette or an empty chair. These images served a dual purpose. First, they were pedagogical. They warned society about the dangers of a fractured home. Second, they functioned as a form of cultural evidence. By portraying himself as the victim of a domestic breakdown, the American man was using art to lobby for his own moral standing. We can look at the works of artists like William Sidney Mount or early Hudson River School painters, who captured the domestic wilderness. In these scenes, the American landscape itself becomes a metaphor for the man's internal state. A lightning-struck tree or a turbulent river in the background of a male portrait during this era was often a coded reference to a stormy domestic life that had ended in the courts. Furthermore, we must examine the technical aspect of pentimento. This is a term used in art history to describe an alteration in a painting evidenced by traces of previous work. In the context of American divorce, pentimento is the ultimate ghost in the machine. There are dozens of portraits in American archives where, under infrared light, we see that a male subject originally had his arm resting on the shoulder of a woman who is no longer there. The cost of these alterations was immense. In the 1840s, commissioning a professional artist to paint out a spouse could cost as much as the original portrait itself. This indicates that for men of a certain class, the visual record of their marriage was a high-stakes asset that had to be managed with the same precision as a land deed or a bank account. The data suggests that as divorce rates began a slow, marginal climb in the late 1800s, the portrait of the bachelor became a distinct subgenre. These were not just young men waiting to be married. They were often divorcees in all but name, rebranding themselves through art. They chose to be painted in athletic poses, or as world travelers or as men of science. They were shifting the narrative from the man who lost his family to the man who found the world. This transition is a critical turning point in U.S. art history, because it marks the first time that a man's identity was permitted to exist entirely outside of the domestic sphere, without being viewed as a failure. In the next sections of this deep dive, we will explore the Gilded Age, where the stakes became even higher. We will look at how the titans of industry used portraiture to navigate international divorce scandals, and how the rise of photography changed the way men deleted their pasts. We will analyze the specific brushwork used by masters like John Singer Sargent and Thomas Eakins to capture the tension of a house divided. This is not just a history of paint. It is a history of the American male's struggle to define himself in the wake of the greatest domestic shift in Western history. We are just scratching the surface of how the legal fight for a man's reputation was won or lost on the canvas long before it was ever settled in a courtroom. To understand the evolution of the male experience in divorce through the lens of art, we must step into the year 2026, where modern analytical tools have allowed us to see through the layers of deception that high society men once used to preserve their reputations. We are entering the Gilded Age, an era where the American elite were building fortunes that rivaled the old monarchies of Europe. But with great wealth came a rigid, uncompromising social code. For a man in 1885, a divorce was not just a domestic failure. It was a threat to his creditworthiness and his standing in the clubs of New York and Philadelphia. The historical trends of this period show a fascinating shift from the total erasure we discussed in the previous section to a more sophisticated form of visual negotiation. Imagine if you were a high-ranking executive in 1890. You have built a mansion on Fifth Avenue and filled it with the finest European art. But your personal life is in shambles. At this time, New York law only permitted divorce on the grounds of adultery. To seek a legal exit from a marriage was to invite a public trial where your most intimate and often embarrassing secrets would be entered into the public record. In this high-stakes environment, men turned to portraiture as a way to preemptively manage the potential outcomes of their social ruin. This is where we see the rise of the individualist aesthetic. A primary case study for this transition is the work of John Singer Sargent. Sargent was the most sought-after portraitist of the era, and he was a master of what we now call the psychological divorce. Look at his portraits of wealthy American men from the late 19th century. Notice the pervasive sense of isolation. Even when these men were technically still married, they were often painted alone in vast, dark halls. They are not depicted as fathers or husbands, but as autonomous islands of power. This was a deliberate step-by-step branding strategy. By separating the man's visual identity from his domestic unit long before a legal separation occurred, the artist created a visual buffer. If a divorce eventually happened, the public was already accustomed to seeing the man as a singular, independent figure. The shock of the split was mitigated because the wife had already been visually phased out of his public persona. Historical trends during the 1890s reveal a specific technique, known as the compositional wedge. In family portraits that were commissioned during periods of marital strife, artists would place physical objects between the husband and wife. A heavy mahogany table, a tall vase, or even a literal pillar of the house would be situated in the center of the canvas, creating a subtle but undeniable barrier. In our current 2026 analysis of these works, we see that these were not just aesthetic choices, they were tactical maneuvers. The husband was asserting his territory within the home, using the canvas to draw a line in the sand. This is a crucial detail because it mirrors the legal reality of the time, where the division of property was becoming a central theme in domestic litigation. Consider the case studies of the divorce colonies in places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Because Eastern laws were so restrictive, men would travel west to take advantage of more lenient residency requirements and broader grounds for divorce. This created a whole subgenre of American art that historians are only now fully categorizing. We see paintings of men in transit, portraits set in train cars or in the rugged, wide-open landscapes of the Dakotas. These images represented a man in a state of becoming. He was shedding the suffocating skin of the Victorian domestic ideal and embracing a new frontier masculinity. This was the birth of the nomadic male trope in U.S. art history. These men weren't just leaving their wives, they were reclaiming their rugged individualism, a core tenet of the American mythos. The depth of this visual strategy goes even further when we look at the depiction of children. In the late 19th century, a father seeking custody was a rare and difficult path, as the tender years doctrine often favored the mother for young children. However, men of power used art to argue for their parental fitness. We see a spike in portraits of men with their sons, specifically in settings that emphasize education and legacy. A man might be shown teaching his son how to read a map or how to handle a horse. This was a visual deposition. It argued that the father was the essential guardian of the child's future and social standing. By emphasizing the vertical bond between father and son, the horizontal bond between husband and wife was made to look secondary and even disposable. Step by step, the American man was using the master painters of his day to rewrite the rules of engagement. If you look at the textures of the clothing in these portraits, there is a meticulous attention to the black silks and heavy wools of the male wardrobe. This is what art historians call the Great Masculine Renunciation. As men's fashion became more uniform and somber, it served as a protective armor. A man in a standard black suit was harder to criticize. He was a pillar of the community, an unchanging constant in a shifting social landscape. This visual consistency was a direct response to the perceived chaos of divorce. While the woman's fashion changed and her social position fluctuated wildly based on her marital status, the man's image remained anchored in the aesthetics of the boardroom. But what happened when the canvas was not enough? In the early 1900s, we began to see the most radical form of artistic divorce, the physical destruction of the medium. There are records of men who, upon the finalization of their legal papers, would hold private ceremonies where the family portraits were literally cut out of their frames. The husband's image would be saved, while the rest was burned. This was more than just spite. It was an attempt to reset the clock. In the absence of digital footprints, if you destroyed the painting, you destroyed the evidence that the marriage ever existed. You could move to a new city, hang your solitary portrait in a new study, and present yourself as a lifelong bachelor or a dignified widower. The potential outcomes of this erasure were often successful, allowing men to remarry into even higher social circles without the baggage of their past. As we analyze these trends from our vantage point in 2026, we realize that the modern struggle for identity after a split is not new. The tools have changed, but the objective remains the same: the preservation of the self in the face of domestic collapse. We see this in the way lighting was used to create a sense of mystery or gravitas around a man who was, in reality, navigating a messy and painful legal battle. The use of deep shadows, chiaroscuro, became a favorite for the divorced man. It allowed him to hide the exhaustion in his eyes while highlighting the strength of his jawline. It was the original filter long before the advent of social media. This mastery of image was not without its costs. The psychological toll of living a dual life, one of public strength and private turmoil, is etched into the very brushstrokes of these masterpieces. If you look closely at the eyes of the men painted by Thomas Eakins, you see a raw, uncompromising honesty that contradicts the formal settings of their portraits. Eakins often refused to flatter his subjects, and in doing so, he captured the true face of the American man in transition. These were men who were often at odds with the very institutions they helped build, including the institution of marriage. But even as these men sought to erase their pasts, the paint itself often betrayed them. Over decades, the chemical composition of the added layers would change at a different rate than the original, leading to the ghostly apparitions we mentioned earlier. The past has a way of bleeding through the present. This brings us to a critical realization. The history of divorce for men in U.S. art is not just a history of what was shown, but a history of what was hidden. It is a story of shadows, of silence, and of the desperate need to maintain control over one's own narrative. As we move into the next phase of this masterclass, we will see how the arrival of the 20th century and the birth of modernism completely shattered these Victorian protections. The age of the solitary patriarch was coming to an end, replaced by something far more fractured and complex. We will examine how the rise of the skyscraper and the urban landscape provided a new backdrop for the divorced man, and how artists like Edward Hopper began to capture the true essence of male loneliness in a way that no portraitist had ever dared. What happens when the armor of the black suit is no longer enough to hide the cracks in the foundation? And how did the introduction of photography turn the secret art of erasure into a public spectacle? The next chapter of this deep dive reveals the moment when the American man's private life finally became unavoidable. The transition from the meticulous control of oil portraiture to the uncompromising lens of the camera changed everything for the American man in the early 20th century. By the time we reached the 1920s, the visual culture of the United States had shifted from the private gallery to the mass-produced magazine and the tabloid newspaper. For the man navigating a divorce during this period, the ability to hide behind a curated canvas was evaporating. Imagine if you were a high-ranking industrialist in 1926. In previous decades, you could simply commission a new portrait and have your former spouse edited out of history. But in the 1920s, the camera was everywhere. A candid shot of you leaving a courtroom or a grainy photograph of you alone at a jazz club spoke louder than any $1,000 painting. This era introduced the public spectacle of domestic failure, and American art began to reflect this new, exposed reality. Historical trends during the 1920s show a massive spike in divorce rates, particularly as more states followed the lead of Nevada, where Reno became the divorce capital of the world. In the art of this period, we see the emergence of the Reno motif. Artists began to capture the specific aesthetic of the temporary bachelor. These were men who were in a state of legal limbo, waiting out their 6-week residency requirements in the high desert. The art shifted from the boardroom to the ranch house and the motel room. We see this in the sketches and watercolors of the period that depict well-dressed Eastern men looking completely out of place against the rugged backdrop of the West. This was a new form of male vulnerability in art. The armor of the black suit was replaced by the uncomfortable, ill-fitting attire of the dude ranch. It was a visual representation of a man stripped of his social context, forced to reinvent himself in a landscape that didn't care about his lineage or his bank account. Case studies of the Ashcan school of painters, such as George Bellows and Robert Henri, provide a gritty look at the urban reality of the separated man. They moved away from the sanitized domestic scenes of the Victorian era and into the streets, the boxing rings, and the cheap tenements. In their work, the male figure is often shown in a state of raw physical struggle. This reflected the contemporary view of divorce as a combative, almost primal process. When we look at Bellows' depictions of men in crowded city spaces, there is a sense of anonymity that was previously unseen. For the divorced man of the 1920s, the city offered a place to disappear. The art of this time captures the paradox of being surrounded by millions, yet remaining fundamentally alone. This was a sharp departure from the solitary patriarchs of the 1800s who were isolated by their power. These new men were isolated by their circumstances. By the 1930s, as the Great Depression took hold, the financial implications of divorce for men became a central theme in American visual culture. This is where we see the rise of the alimony narrative in editorial art and social realism. Imagine a man named Robert, a fictionalized but representative character based on thousands of real-life cases from 1934. Robert was once a successful architect, but now he is shown in a stark, minimalist office, staring at a stack of legal papers. The lighting is harsh and overhead, creating deep pockets of shadow under his eyes. This was the era of the man in the shadows. In the art of the 1930s, the divorced man is often portrayed as a victim of a system that he no longer understands. The focus shifted from his character to his burden. We see paintings where the man is literally weighed down by heavy coats, thick briefcases, and the looming architecture of the city. The potential outcomes of his legal battle were no longer just social ostracization. They were total financial collapse. This brings us to the most significant figure in the art of male isolation, Edward Hopper. Hopper's work is the definitive masterclass in the psychology of the modern American man. In his 1932 masterpiece Room in New York, we see a man and a woman in a room together, yet they are light years apart. The man is hunched over a newspaper, his face partially obscured, while the woman distractedly touches a piano key. There is no dialogue, no connection, and no hope of reconciliation. This painting captures the pre-divorce stasis, the moment when a marriage has ended in spirit, but not yet in law. Hopper's use of light is clinical. It doesn't flatter, it dissects. For the American man in 2026 looking back at this work, it remains a hauntingly accurate depiction of the domestic friction that precedes a formal split. Hopper didn't need to show a courtroom to show a divorce. He showed the silence that makes the courtroom inevitable. Another crucial case study in the Hopper canon is his most famous work, Nighthawks, painted in 1942. While it is often discussed as a study of wartime loneliness, it is also a profound look at the male experience of the urban bachelor. Look at the man sitting with his back to the viewer. He is anonymous, self-contained, and utterly detached from the couple across the counter. In the context of 1940s divorce trends, this man represents the growing population of men who lived their lives in the third spaces of American society: diners, hotel lobbies, and movie theaters. They were the men who had lost their domestic anchors and were now drifting through the neon-lit night. The lack of a door in the diner is a powerful metaphor. These men are trapped in their independence. The potential outcomes of their freedom were a total loss of privacy and a perpetual state of transit. Step by step, the 20th century was stripping away the layers of protection that the 19th century man had enjoyed. The introduction of the candid photograph meant that a man's mistakes were now permanent. We see this reflected in the art of the 1940s through the technique of the fractured composition. Artists began to use mirrors, windows, and reflections to break up the male image. A man would be painted looking into a glass window, his reflection distorted and overlapping with the world outside. This was a visual representation of the fragmented identity that comes with divorce. Who is the man without his role as a husband? Who is he when his reflection no longer includes a family? This was the existential question that American art was beginning to ask. The depth of this shift is also evident in the changing portrayal of the male physique. In the Gilded Age, a man's power was often conveyed through his girth and the perceived weight of his presence. By the mid-20th century, the divorced or solitary man in art became leaner, more angular, and more restless. This reflected a change in the American masculine ideal, from the sedentary ruler of the home to the mobile, adaptable individual. However, this mobility came at a price. The data from art exhibitions in the late 1940s shows a significant increase in works titled with variations of departure, the traveler, or the stranger. The divorced man was no longer a person. He was a direction. He was always moving away from something, but the art rarely showed him arriving anywhere. As we move toward the mid-century mark, we enter the era of the man in the gray flannel suit. The 1950s would bring a new kind of pressure, the pressure of perfect suburban conformity. For a man in 1955, a divorce was an act of subversion against the American dream itself. How did the artists of the Cold War era capture the silent desperation of a man trying to maintain appearances while his world was falling apart? And how did the rise of the suburban landscape provide a new, even more terrifying backdrop for the divorced male experience? In the next part of our series, we go behind the white picket fences to uncover the hidden art of the suburban split, and the moment when the American man's struggle for identity reached a fever pitch in the age of television and the nuclear family. What happens when the image of the perfect father is the only thing keeping a man from total social liquidation? The answers lie in the glossy surfaces and hidden depths of the 1950s. To understand the 1950s, we have to look past the neon signs and the chrome-heavy fenders of the classic American car. We are entering the era of the man in the gray flannel suit. In the year 2026, when we look back at the historical trends of mid-century America, we see a culture that was obsessed with the concept of containment. This was the age of the nuclear family, a term borrowed from the very physics that define the Cold War. In this environment, a man's identity was no longer just his own. It was a component of a larger, highly pressurized system. If that system failed, if a marriage dissolved, it was seen as a structural failure that threatened the stability of the entire neighborhood. This created a fascinating and often tragic tension in the art of the time. Imagine if you were James, a rising executive at a firm in Manhattan in 1955. Your office is a masterclass in mid-century modern design. Clean lines, teak wood, and a single framed photograph of your wife and 3 children on your desk. For James, that photograph is more than a sentimental keepsake. It is a passport. It grants him access to the country club, the senior management tier, and the respect of his peers. Now, imagine that James is going through a silent, agonizing separation. In 1955, James cannot simply change his status on a social media profile. To do so would be to invite a total social liquidation. The art of this period, particularly the commercial and illustrative art that dominated the American psyche, reflects this desperate need to maintain the image of the perfect father and husband at all costs. A primary case study for this era is the work of Norman Rockwell. While often dismissed as mere nostalgia, Rockwell was the ultimate chronicler of the American male's domestic performance. Look at his 1950s covers for the Saturday Evening Post. Notice the meticulous detail in the fathers he portrays. They are always providing, always protecting, and always present. But if we analyze these works through the lens of modern sociology in 2026, we see the cracks. In many of Rockwell's family scenes, the father is slightly marginalized. He is at the edge of the frame, or his back is to the viewer as he carves a turkey or adjusts a television set. This visual distancing suggests a man who is a provider in body but perhaps an exile in spirit. For the man contemplating divorce in the 1950s, Rockwell's art was both an ideal to strive for and a prison that kept him trapped in a failing union. Historical trends show that while divorce rates in the early 1950s were relatively low compared to the decades that followed, the psychological pressure of the unseen divorce was at an all-time high. This led to a dramatic split in American art styles. On one hand, you had the glossy, high-saturation world of advertising art, the images found in the Sears catalog or Life magazine. These images were designed to be frictionless. They showed men in perfectly pressed suits, standing in front of suburban ranch houses. There is a step-by-step uniformity to these depictions. The confident stance, the pipe in hand, the wife waving from the doorway. This was the visual armor of the American man. It was a projection of stability that acted as a shield against any rumors of domestic strife. However, on the other hand, we see the rise of abstract expressionism. This was the era of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Willem de Kooning. While the surface of America was neat and suburban, the art world was exploding with chaos, violence, and raw emotion. In the context of our deep dive, abstract expressionism can be viewed as the internal world of the 1950s man. It was the only place where he was allowed to be messy. While James had to keep his tie straight and his marriage intact for the sake of his career, the artists of the era were splashing paint across canvases in a way that mirrored the internal disintegration of the domestic dream. Pollock's chaotic drips were the visual equivalent of a man's world falling apart, a rejection of the clean lines and rigid expectations of the corporate office. The data from this period reveals a fascinating intersection between the law and the canvas. In the mid-1950s, the tender years doctrine remained the primary legal standard for custody, meaning that a divorced man was almost guaranteed to lose daily contact with his children. This reality is coded into the art of the time through the theme of the empty chair. We see this in the more somber genre paintings of the era, where a male figure is shown sitting alone in a diner or a park, surrounded by spaces where a family should be. Unlike the 19th century portraits of solitary power, these 1950s images are defined by a sense of lack. The man is not solitary by choice. He is a fragment of a broken whole. Step by step, the 1950s man was navigating a minefield. If he pursued a divorce, he faced the potential outcomes of being fired from his job, being barred from his social circles, and becoming a visitor in the lives of his children. To cope, many men turned to a new kind of artistic expression, the hobbyist movement. The 1950s saw a massive boom in DIY culture, from building model airplanes to painting by numbers. This was a form of domestic escape. By focusing on a hyper-detailed, controlled task, a man could reclaim a sense of agency that he was losing in his marriage. The art produced in these suburban garages and basements was a quiet protest. It was a space where the man was the sole creator and the sole judge, free from the crushing weight of being the perfect husband. Another critical case study is the transition of the male image in film noir, which had a profound impact on American painting. Artists like Edward Hopper continued to influence the visual language of the 1950s, but with an added layer of Cold War paranoia. The divorced or separating man in art became synonymous with the private investigator or the fugitive, figures who operated on the fringes of society. They were often painted in high-contrast lighting, with long shadows that seemed to pull them back into the darkness. This was the visual representation of the social shadow that followed a divorced man. He was someone who had failed the ultimate test of American citizenship, the maintenance of the nuclear home. By the late 1950s, the pressure cooker was beginning to whistle. The introduction of the first mass-marketed anti-anxiety medications coincided with a shift in art toward a more cynical, detached view of the American home. We begin to see paintings that satirize the suburban ideal, showing the hollowness behind the bright colors. The man in these works is often depicted as a ghost in his own house, a spectral figure who is disconnected from the very life he is working to fund. This sets the stage for the total cultural explosion of the 1960s. As we move into the next part of this masterclass, we will witness the moment the dam finally broke. The 1960s and 70s brought the rise of no-fault divorce and the sexual revolution, but they also brought a radical new visual language for the American male. How did the pop art movement of Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein turn the pain of domestic collapse into a comic strip? And what happened to the image of the American father when he was suddenly allowed to walk away? We will explore the era of the counterculture, where the gray flannel suit was burned, and the American man began a chaotic, colorful, and often devastating search for a new way to be. The transition from the rigid 1950s to the liberated 1970s is the most dramatic shift in the history of the American split, and the art that emerged from this period is nothing short of revolutionary. What does a man look like when he is finally free to fall apart? The next chapter reveals the answer. The answer begins with the total disintegration of the canvas as we knew it. As we look back from the year 2026, we can see that the 1960s and 70s represented a tectonic shift in the American landscape, not just legally but visually. This was the era where the facade of the nuclear family didn't just crack. It exploded into a million neon-colored pieces. The historical trends of this period show a direct correlation between the rise of the counterculture and the legislative birth of no-fault divorce, beginning with California in 1969. For the American man, this meant the legal requirement to prove a wife's wrongdoing was gone. But it also meant that his role as the undisputed head of the household was officially deconstructed. In art, this transition was captured by a movement that turned domestic pain into a mass-produced commodity: pop art. Imagine if you were Mark, a middle management professional in 1972. In the 1950s, your divorce would have been a hush scandal whispered about at the water cooler. But in 1972, Mark is living through a revolution. He has moved out of the suburban colonial and into a modular apartment complex with floor-to-ceiling windows and a shag carpet. To understand Mark's psyche, we have to look at the work of Roy Lichtenstein. Lichtenstein took the most dramatic, gut-wrenching moments of domestic life and rendered them in the style of a comic book: thick black outlines, primary colors, and benday dots. When we analyze a Lichtenstein piece in 2026, we see a profound distancing mechanism. For a man like Mark, the emotions of a divorce were too raw to be painted in the heavy, soulful oils of the past. Instead, the art of his era reflected his life back to him as a series of cliches and speech bubbles. This was the era of the irony of the individual. By turning a man's domestic collapse into a comic strip, the art served as a psychological buffer. If your life looks like a cartoon, the pain feels less permanent. This was a step-by-step coping strategy for a generation of men who were suddenly untethered from the rigid structures of their fathers. Historical trends show that between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rate in the United States more than doubled. This statistical surge created a new demographic in the art world: the urban nomad. This man was no longer defined by his land or his lineage, but by his consumption. This is where Andy Warhol becomes the ultimate historian of the male split. Warhol's portraits of the 1970s treated everyone, from celebrities to businessmen, with the same repetitive, silk-screened indifference. For a man navigating a divorce, Warhol's style was the ultimate equalizer. It suggested that a man's identity was something that could be reproduced, recolored, and replaced. Case studies of Warhol's male subjects from this era reveal a striking lack of domestic context. There are no wives, no children, and no homes in the background, just flat planes of color. The man had become a brand, and like any brand, he could be rebranded after a legal separation. But while pop art was making light of the domestic sphere, another movement was documenting the gritty, unvarnished reality of the newly single man: photorealism. Artists like Richard Estes began painting the reflections in the glass windows of New York City diners and office buildings. If you look closely at these works, the human figures are often distorted, fragmented, and layered behind reflections of traffic and neon signs. For the American man in 1975, this was the most accurate portrait of his life. He was a man seen through a glass darkly. He was no longer the center of the composition. He was just another element in a chaotic urban environment. The potential outcomes of this visual fragmentation were a total loss of the self. The man was becoming invisible in the very world he had built. Step by step, the 1970s also redefined the father-child relationship in American art. With the rise of joint custody discussions and the increasing visibility of the weekend dad, we see a new type of genre painting. These were scenes set in neutral, public spaces, playgrounds, zoos, and fast food restaurants. The art of this period captures a specific kind of male anxiety, the anxiety of the visitor. Unlike the 19th century portraits where the father was the pillar of the home, these 1970s works show men who are slightly out of place, clutching a child's hand in a crowded park. There is a sense of frantic, timed affection. This was the visual birth of the liminal father, a man whose parenting existed in the gaps between legal appointments. The data from art galleries in the late 70s also shows a shift toward earthworks and minimalism. While this might seem unrelated to divorce, many art historians in 2026 argue that these movements represented a man's desire to return to something foundational and unshakable. When the domestic world is in flux, the American man turned to the literal earth. Massive projects like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty were acts of male dominance over the landscape, a way to exert control when the control over his private life had been stripped away. It was a retreat from the messiness of human relationships into the purity of geometric form and raw material. Furthermore, we must examine the aesthetics of the bachelor pad. In the 1970s, interior design became a form of self-taught art for the divorced man. This was the era of the conversation pit, the home bar, and the hi-fi stereo system. For a man in 2026 looking back at 1976, these spaces were more than just apartments. They were stages of autonomy. The art that hung on these walls was often abstract, aggressive, and devoid of sentimental value. It was a rejection of the floral and feminine influence of the family home. This was a man using his environment to declare his independence, even if that independence was often tinged with a deep, unspoken loneliness. We also see a fascinating case study in the evolution of the self-portrait. In the 70s, male artists began to experiment with performance art and photography to document their own aging and isolation. They were no longer painting themselves as heroes, but as specimens. They would take a photo of themselves every day, or record their daily routines in exhaustive, boring detail. This was a response to the loss of the witness. When a man is married, his life is witnessed by his spouse. When he is divorced, he becomes his own witness. The art of this era is the sound of a man talking to himself in an empty room. The transition from the 1970s into the 1980s would bring another radical shift. We were moving from the me decade of self-discovery into the gecko era of hypercapitalism. The divorced man was about to be reimagined once again, this time as a power player. But beneath the power suits and the corporate takeovers, a new kind of crisis was brewing. As we prepare for the next part of this masterclass, we will dive into the 1980s, where the divorce became a trophy of a different kind. We will look at how the neo-expressionist movement brought a violent, chaotic energy back to the male figure, and how the yuppie culture turned the legal battle into a spectator sport. What happens when a man's worth is measured solely by what he keeps in the settlement? And how did the art of the 80s predict the digital isolation of the modern era? The next chapter explores the high-gloss, high-stakes world of the Reagan-era divorce, where the image was everything, and the cost of maintaining it was higher than ever before. The transition into the 1980s brought a sharp, synthetic edge to the American experience of domestic dissolution. If the 1970s were about finding yourself through the fog of the sexual revolution, the 1980s were about rebranding yourself through the fire of hypercapitalism. We are entering the era of the power divorce. In the year 2026, as we look back at the historical trends of this decade, we see that the American man's identity became inextricably linked to his output, his assets, and his ability to project an image of invulnerability. This was the decade of the yuppie, the young urban professional, and for this man, a divorce was not just a personal failure. It was a high-stakes merger that had gone south. The art of this period reflected this new, aggressive reality through a movement known as neo-expressionism. Imagine if you were David, a high-flying bond trader in 1986. You live in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Your home is a curated gallery of contemporary art, specifically chosen to signal your status and your discernment. But beneath the surface, your marriage is a battlefield of litigation and asset division. For David, the art on his walls is no longer just decoration. It is a financial statement. In the 1980s, we see the rise of the art market as a primary vehicle for wealth storage and status signaling among divorced men. A man like David wouldn't commission a quiet family portrait. He would buy a massive, violent canvas by Julian Schnabel. A primary case study for this era is the work of Julian Schnabel, particularly his famous plate paintings. Schnabel would take large wooden panels and cover them with broken ceramic plates before painting over them with heavy, expressive strokes. When we analyze these works from our vantage point in 2026, the symbolism is almost too perfect. These paintings represent the shattered domestic table, the very objects associated with a shared family meal. The ceramic plates have been smashed and repurposed into an aggressive, masculine display of power. For a man navigating the potential outcomes of a high-asset divorce in the 80s, Schnabel's work resonated because it turned destruction into something valuable. It argued that a man could take the ruins of his domestic life and, through sheer force of will, turn them into a monument to his own survival. Historical trends show that the 1980s were the decade where the prenuptial agreement moved from the fringes of celebrity culture into the mainstream of the American professional class. This legal reality is coded into the art of the time through the theme of hypermaterialism. We see this in the work of Jeff Koons, who began his career in the 80s. His early works, like the Equilibrium series, featuring basketballs suspended in tanks of water, captured the delicate, pressurized balance of the modern man's life. For the divorced man of the 80s, these works were a visual representation of his own status. Perfectly poised, highly expensive, and completely artificial. The man was no longer a person. He was a carefully maintained environment. Step by step, the 80s man was also being redefined by the photography of Robert Longo. His series, Men in the Cities, is perhaps the most iconic representation of the Reagan-era male. These larger-than-life charcoal drawings depict men in sharp suits, contorted in positions that suggest they are either dancing or being hit by a bullet. For the American man in 2026 looking back at these images, they capture the duality of the 80s divorce experience. The man is still in his uniform, the power suit, but he is in a state of total violent agitation. He is untethered from the ground, caught in a moment of existential crisis. These figures are isolated, with no background and no context. They represent the man who has been stripped of his domestic anchors and is now spinning in the void of the urban landscape. The data from the 1980s also points to a significant shift in how men viewed their physical self after a split. This was the decade of the fitness boom, and the art of the time reflected a new obsession with the muscular, disciplined male form. We see this in the photography of Herb Ritts and the late work of Robert Mapplethorpe. The divorced man was using his body as a new kind of canvas. If he couldn't control his marriage or the division of his property, he could control his physique. The art of this period emphasizes the classical male nude, but with a modern, cold, and almost metallic finish. This was the man as a machine, efficient, powerful, and solitary. Consider the case studies of the Neo-Geo movement, which emerged in the mid-80s. Artists like Peter Halley painted abstract compositions that looked like architectural diagrams or circuit boards. He called them prisons and cells. For a man like David, these paintings were a literal map of his life. His office was a cell, his apartment was a cell, and his divorce was a series of conduits connecting the two. This was a radical departure from the open landscapes of the 19th century. The American man was now living in a world of rigid boundaries and digital-like isolation. The potential outcomes of this environment were a sense of total compartmentalization. A man could be a shark in the boardroom while being a ghost in his own life. The depth of this shift is also evident in the way Jean-Michel Basquiat captured the fragmentation of the male identity. Basquiat's work, while deeply rooted in his own experience, became a mirror for the chaotic, multi-layered reality of the 80s. His paintings are filled with anatomical diagrams, crossed-out words, and crowned figures. For the divorced man, these works represented the mental ledger of a split. The crown represented the status he was fighting to keep, while the skeletal figures represented the raw, exposed vulnerability that lay beneath the power suit. Basquiat's use of the X-out, crossing out words so that the viewer wants to read them more, is a perfect metaphor for the 80s divorce. The man tries to cross out his past, but in doing so, he only makes it more visible. As we move into the late 80s, the high-gloss surfaces began to crack. The 1987 stock market crash served as a cultural reset, and the art world began to move away from the massive, expensive canvases of the neo-expressionists. We see the emergence of identity politics in art that was more concerned with the body, illness, and the fragility of human connection. For the American man, the era of the invincible yuppie was ending. He was left in his minimalist apartment, surrounded by expensive art, but facing a new kind of loneliness that couldn't be solved by a capital gain. By the time we hit 1990, the American man was exhausted. The legal battles of the 80s had left a generation of men financially successful, but emotionally bankrupt. The art of the upcoming decade would reflect a return to the personal, the quiet, and the raw. We were moving away from the skyscraper and back into the bedroom, but this time the bedroom was empty. How did the grunge movement and the rise of digital art change the way men processed their domestic trauma? And what happened when the American man finally stopped trying to look like a hero and started looking like a human again? In the next part of our masterclass, we dive into the 1990s, the decade of the sensitive male and the rise of the internet. We will examine how the art of Nan Goldin and Felix Gonzalez Torres redefined the concepts of loss and intimacy, and how the arrival of the World Wide Web created the first digital footprints of a divorce. We will explore the era of the alternative man, where the suit was traded for flannel, and the power divorce was replaced by the existential search for meaning. What happens when a man's history is no longer just in a painting but on a hard drive? The answers lie in the pixelated, raw, and deeply personal art of the 1990s. The shift from the power of the 80s to the vulnerability of the 90s is the most human chapter in our story. The 1990s arrived not with a bang, but with a collective cultural exhale. The high-octane, neon-soaked aggression of the Reagan years had left the American male exhausted, and the art of this decade reflects a profound retreat into the raw, the unpolished, and the deeply personal. In the year 2026, we look back at the historical trends of the 1990s and see the birth of what we now call the post-heroic era of American masculinity. For the man navigating a divorce in 1994, the objective was no longer to look like an invincible titan of industry. Instead, the cultural tide shifted toward authenticity, a messy, often painful honesty that was mirrored in the rise of grunge and the snapshot aesthetic. Imagine if you were Jason, a graphic designer in San Francisco in 1996. You are part of the first generation to witness the transition from a paper-based life to a digital one. When your marriage ends, the evidence is no longer just a physical painting or a stack of photographs in a shoebox. It is a collection of files on a beige desktop computer. For Jason, the process of domestic dissolution feels pixelated. In our 2026 analysis of the art from this period, we see that the canvas was being replaced by the screen, and the way men process loss began to take on a fragmented, low-resolution quality. A primary case study for this era is the work of Nan Goldin. While her work began earlier, her influence peaked in the 90s, defining the visual language of intimacy and its aftermath. Goldin's photography was the antithesis of the Gilded Age portrait. It was dimly lit, out of focus, and brutally honest. For the American man in the 90s, Goldin's work provided a new template for seeing himself. He was no longer the stoic patriarch. He was the man in the aftermath. We see photographs of men sitting on the edge of unmade beds in cheap motels, the fluorescent light reflecting off a half-empty bottle of soda. This was the visual record of the divorcee in the age of the indie film. It argued that there was a certain dignity in the wreckage, a truth that could only be found in the moments when the mask finally slipped. Historical trends during the 1990s also show a significant shift in the legal landscape with the widespread adoption of mediation and the best interests of the child standard. This led to a more nuanced, albeit still difficult, path for fathers seeking joint custody. In art, this transition was captured by the movement known as abject art. Artists like Mike Kelly used discarded domestic objects, old blankets, stained stuffed animals, and worn-out carpets to create massive installations that explored the trauma of the American home. For a man like Jason, looking at a Mike Kelly piece in 1995 was like looking at the contents of his storage unit after a split. The art was a graveyard of domesticity. By using these pathetic, everyday items, Kelly highlighted the psychological weight of what a man loses when the family unit breaks. It wasn't about the loss of a mansion, It was about the loss of the mundane, everyday connection to childhood and legacy. Step by step, the 90s man was also being influenced by the concept of absence as an art form. Consider the case studies of Félix González Torres. His work often consisted of simple, pairs of identical objects, two clocks ticking in unison, or two light bulbs hanging side by side. Over time, the clocks would fall out of sync or one bulb would burn out. This was a devastatingly effective metaphor for the 1990s divorce. It captured the slow, inevitable divergence of two lives that were once perfectly aligned. For the man in 2026, González Torres's work remains a masterclass in the aesthetics of loss. It showed that you didn't need to paint a weeping man to show a broken heart. You just had to show the space where something used to be. The data from the mid-90s indicates that as the internet began to permeate the American home, the first digital footprints of divorce started to appear. This is where we see the rise of the pixelated past. Early digital art and net art began to explore themes of data corruption and deletion. For a man navigating a legal separation, the act of dragging a folder of wedding photos into the trash bin on a computer was a new kind of ritual. It was faster than burning a canvas but felt strangely more permanent. The art of this time began to incorporate the aesthetic of the glitch, the moment when an image breaks down into blocks of color. This reflected the fragmented identity of the 90s man. He was trying to reconcile his analog past with his digital future, all while his domestic present was in a state of system failure. Furthermore, we must examine the influence of the alternative rock movement on the visual arts. The 1990s was the decade of the sensitive male, a trope that was both celebrated and lampooned. In painting, this resulted in a return to figuration but with a twist. Artists like John Curran and Elizabeth Peyton painted men who were slender, pale, and often appeared fragile. This was a radical departure from the muscular, bronzed men of the 80s. For the divorced man, this new aesthetic offered a form of permission. He was allowed to be lean, he was allowed to be tired, and he was allowed to be seen as a work in progress rather than a finished product. The potential outcomes of this shift were a more empathetic view of the male experience, though it often came with a sense of aimlessness. The depth of this shift is also evident in the way men began to curate their own solitary spaces. The 1990s saw the birth of the Bachelor Pad 2.0. Unlike the high-gloss versions of the 70s, the 90s version was defined by the home office. The presence of the computer, the printer, and the fax machine meant that the divorced man's home was now a site of constant labor. The art he chose for these spaces was often minimalist and cerebral, black and white photography, or abstract prints that emphasized structure and logic. It was a way of imposing order on a life that felt increasingly chaotic. The historical trends show that as work and home life blurred, the divorced man's identity became more tied to his professional output than ever before, but in a way that was more isolated and internal than the corporate warriors of the previous decade. As we moved toward the turn of the millennium, the American man was standing on the precipice of a total technological revolution. The 1990s had stripped away the armor and exposed the nerves, but the 2000s would bring a new set of challenges: the total visibility of the social media age, and the rise of the nonlinear life. The art of the 90s was the last gasp of the private struggle. By 1999, the lines between the public and the private were about to vanish forever. What happens to a man's reputation when his divorce is no longer a secret kept in a gallery, but a status update shared with the world? How did the arrival of the smartphone turn every American man into his own art director, constantly editing and filtering his domestic reality? In the next part of our masterclass, we enter the 2000s, the decade of the big data split. We will examine how the rise of street art and the work of Banksy and Shepard Fairey provided a new public canvas for male frustration, and how the aesthetic of the minimalist lifestyle became the new shield for the modern divorcee. We are moving from the raw intimacy of the 90s into the high-definition, hyper-connected world of the 21st century. The American man's search for identity is about to go viral. The next chapter reveals the moment when the divorce moved from the canvas to the cloud. The transition from the raw, analog intimacy of the 1990s to the high-definition, hyper-connected world of the 21st century was not just a technological shift, it was a psychological migration. As we look back from the year 2026, we can see that the early 2000s marked the moment when the American man's struggle with domestic dissolution moved from the physical canvas to the digital cloud. This was the era of the first true digital footprints, where a man's history was no longer written in ink or paint, but in code and pixels. The historical trends of this period reveal a fascinating paradox. As men's lives became more public through social media, their artistic expressions of grief and separation became more curated, more sterile, and ultimately, more shielded. Imagine if you were Brian, a software engineer in 2006, living through a divorce in the early days of the social media boom. In 1986, your divorce would have been a private matter of legal documents and physical property. In 2006, Brian is the first to experience the digital stain. Every photo uploaded to a nascent Facebook or MySpace profile, every digital archive of a shared vacation, becomes a hauntological artifact that cannot be easily burned or painted over. For Brian, the art of the 2000s divorce is the art of the delete key. This was the birth of the aesthetic of erasure in the digital age. Unlike the physical erasure of the Gilded Age, where a wife was painted out of a portrait, the 2000s man was engaged in the systematic scrubbing of his digital timeline. This created a new kind of visual literacy where the absence of data was more telling than its presence. A primary case study for this era is the rise of street art as a medium for male domestic protest. While we often think of Banksy or Shepard Fairey in terms of political commentary, a deep dive into the historical trends of the early 2000s shows that the imagery of the street became a surrogate for the domestic wall. For the American man who had lost his home in a settlement, the city became his canvas. Consider the iconic work of Banksy, specifically pieces like The Flower Thrower. While ostensibly about political riot, art historians in 2026 analyze these works as metaphors for the explosive, frustrating energy of the modern man in transition. The man is caught in a moment of violent action, yet he is throwing something fragile and beautiful. This mirrors the delicate balance of the 2000s divorcee, a man forced into a combative legal stance while trying to preserve his role as a provider or father. Historical trends show that by 2008, the Great Recession added a layer of financial devastation to the domestic landscape. This led to the emergence of the minimalism of necessity. Imagine the divorced man's apartment in 2009. It was no longer the high-gloss bachelor pad of the 70s or the tech-heavy office of the 90s. It was a space defined by the stripped-back aesthetic of the recession. The art of this time, influenced by the New Sincerity movement, moved away from the irony of the 90s and toward a stark, functional honesty. We see paintings and photography that focus on the geometry of empty spaces. This was the era of the white wall. For the American man, the lack of decoration was a way to exert control over a life that felt financially and emotionally bankrupt. The potential outcomes of this aesthetic were a sense of clarity and a fresh start, but it often masked a deep underlying sense of displacement. Step by step, the 2000s also saw the transformation of the male portrait through the lens of the smartphone. By 2010, the selfie had begun to emerge as a dominant form of self-expression. For the divorced man, this was a revolutionary tool. For the first time in U.S. art history, the subject was also the artist, the curator, and the distributor. This led to the rise of the curated bachelor. We see historical trends in photography where men began to use specific filters and angles to project a version of their lives that was rugged, adventurous, and entirely independent. The data shows a spike in outdoor and travel-related imagery among single men during this time. This was a visual rebranding strategy designed to mitigate the social stigma of a broken home. By portraying himself as an explorer or an athlete, the man was using digital art to distance himself from the reality of the courtroom. Another critical case study is the work of Taryn Simon and her series on the Innocence Project. While her work focused on those wrongly convicted, the aesthetic, clinical, high contrast, and focused on the evidence became a major influence on how American men documented their own lives during legal battles. We see a shift in genre painting and photography toward the archive. Men began to create art out of the artifacts of their divorce: the legal letters, the keys to a former house, the receipts of a shared life. This was the art of the deposition. It was a way for men to process the trauma of the legal system by turning the system's own tools into an aesthetic object. In 2026, we recognize this as a crucial step in the evolution of the male voice in art, a move from emotional expression to evidentiary documentation. The depth of this shift is also evident in the way digital glitch art began to represent the fractured male psyche. As the 2000s progressed, artists began to intentionally corrupt digital files to create distorted, unrecognizable images. For a man navigating a high-stakes divorce, the glitch was the perfect metaphor for his identity. He was a person whose life had been corrupted by a system failure. This was a radical departure from the smooth, heroic portraits of the past. The 2000s man was the first to accept and even celebrate his own distortion. This led to the potential outcomes of a more complex, less rigid definition of masculinity, but but it also contributed to a sense of digital isolation. Furthermore, we must examine the rise of the man cave as a form of folk art. In the mid-2000s, the creation of a hypermasculine, isolated space within or after a domestic union became a cultural phenomenon. These spaces were often curated with sports memorabilia, neon signs, and vintage posters. While dismissed as kitsch at the time, art historians in 2026 view the man cave as a form of installation art. It was the divorced man's attempt to create a private museum of his own identity, free from the compromise of the shared home. The historical trends show that these spaces were the final holdouts of the analog man in an increasingly digital world. As we move toward the mid-2010s, the advent of high-speed data and the ubiquity of the cloud meant that a man's past was always present. There was no longer a way to truly delete the digital stain. This brings us to the most modern and perhaps most terrifying chapter of our masterclass. We are entering the era of the nonlinear life, where the past, present, and future overlap in a continuous digital stream. How did the rise of artificial intelligence and deepfake technology change the way men interact with their own memories of a marriage? And what happens when the art of the divorce is no longer created by the man himself, but by an algorithm designed to maximize engagement? In the next part of our series, we move into the late 2010s and the early 2020s, the era of the algorithmic split and the rise of the metaverse. We will examine how the American man began to build digital sanctuaries, and how the concept of the NFT turned the artifacts of a breakup into a tradable commodity. We will explore the moment when the physical reality of the courtroom was replaced by the virtual reality of the digital forum. What happens when your history is no longer just in the cloud, but is being used to train the next generation of AI? The answers lie in the high-frequency, data-driven world of the modern era, where the American man's search for identity has reached its most complex and final form. The transition from the delete key to the generative prompt is the final frontier in our story. The transition from the delete key to the generative prompt is the final frontier in our story. By the late 2010s and leading into our current year of 2026, the American man's relationship with his own domestic history has become a feedback loop of algorithmic curation and artificial reconstruction. We are no longer in an era where you simply hide a painting in the attic or burn a photograph. We are in the era of the algorithmic split. In this digital landscape, your past is not a static object. It is a living data set that the world's most powerful software uses to predict your future. For the man navigating a divorce in 2026, art is no longer about capturing a moment, but about managing a stream. Imagine a man named Michael. In 2026, Michael is a 42-year-old project manager living in a smart home apartment in Chicago. He is 6 months into a highly contested legal separation. When Michael wakes up, his smart gallery wall displays a rotation of high-definition digital art. Before the split, this wall showcased a collaborative aesthetic, travel photos from Japan, a digital rendering of their first home, and candid shots of his children. Now, Michael is faced with a problem that the Gilded Age patriarchs never had to solve: automated memory persistence. His phone's AI periodically generates for you videos, complete with upbeat soundtracks, featuring the very life he is currently trying to dismantle in a courtroom. For Michael, the modern equivalent of the Victorian painter's brush is the generative infilling tool. Historical trends in the early 2020s showed a massive surge in the use of AI-driven photo editing, not for artistic merit, but for domestic hygiene. Michael spends his evenings using software to meticulously remove his ex-spouse from the background of 5 years of vacation photos. This is the new pentimento. However, unlike the oil paint of the 19th century, which left a physical ridge on the canvas, Michael's digital edits are seamless. He is using AI to create a flawless, alternative history where he was always a solitary traveler, always an independent adventurer. This is art as a form of digital gaslighting, where the man reconfigures his own memory to mitigate the potential outcomes of emotional collapse. This brings us to a major case study in 21st century art: the NFT of the abandoned asset. Around 2021, we saw a bizarre but telling trend where men began to tokenize the digital remnants of their marriages. There are documented cases of men attempting to sell the smart contract rights to their wedding videos or high-resolution scans of their prenuptial agreements as digital art. This was more than just a financial maneuver. It was a way to turn a liability into a commodity. By transforming the artifacts of a failed union into a tradable asset on the blockchain, the man was attempting to reclaim a sense of agency. If the marriage was a loss, the art of the marriage could at least be a transaction. In the historical trends of 2026, We see this as the ultimate manifestation of the yuppie divorce of the 80s, now upgraded with the cold, hard logic of the decentralized ledger. Step by step, the technology has also changed how men view their own physicality in the wake of a split. We have moved from the 1950s gym culture to the 2020s avatar aesthetic. For a man in Michael's position, his primary visual representation isn't his physical body, but his digital double in various professional and social metaverses. When the physical home is divided, the man often retreats into the construction of a virtual sanctuary. These are hyper-minimalist digital environments where every light source, every texture, and every view is under his absolute control. This is the Bachelor Pad 3.0. In these spaces, Michael can surround himself with generative art that responds to his biometric data. If his heart rate is high from a stressful legal call, the art on his virtual walls shifts from jagged, aggressive reds to soothing algorithmic blues. The art has become a prosthetic for his emotional regulation. Data from 2025 indicates that nearly 40% of American men going through a domestic transition have used some form of generative art to visualize their future. This is a fascinating shift in the psychology of the split. Instead of looking back, men are using AI to look forward. They input prompts like, a successful man in a minimalist apartment overlooking the ocean, 8K resolution, cinematic lighting, stoic, peaceful. These images serve as a visual North Star. They are a form of manifest destiny through the pixel. The man isn't just surviving a divorce, he is art directing his next chapter. However, there is a darker side to this high-definition control. We must examine the case study of the deepfake legacy. As AI video technology became ubiquitous in the mid-2020s, a disturbing trend emerged in certain circles of men's domestic litigation support groups. Men began using AI to swap their own faces into generic videos of father-son activities, or to alter the audio of old home movies to create a more favorable narrative of their domestic presence. While this is often viewed through a legal or ethical lens, art historians in 2026 view it as the final evolution of the erasure portrait. It is the point where the distinction between what happened and what we wish happened is completely obliterated. The potential outcomes of this technology are a total destabilization of the historical record. Furthermore, we must look at the rise of data-driven abstraction. Contemporary artists like Refik Anadol, who uses massive datasets to create flowing, fluid digital sculptures, have influenced a new generation of male artists who are documenting their divorces through metadata. A man might take the thousands of text messages exchanged during a breakup and run them through a program that converts the frequency and sentiment of the words into a 3D printed sculpture. This is the art of the log file. It is cold, it is abstract, and it is entirely detached from the human heat of the argument. It allows the man to hold the chaos of his life in his hand as a neat geometric object. It is the ultimate form of intellectualization, a defense mechanism that has been a staple of the American male experience since the first solitary portraits of the 1800s. As we stand in 2026, the American man is more visually empowered and more isolated than ever before. He has the tools to rewrite his past, curate his present, and generate his future with a few keystrokes. But the depth of this control brings a new kind of existential vertigo. When your life is a series of prompts and your memories are a collection of edited files, where does the real man reside? We have moved from the heavy, permanent oil paint of the Gilded Age to the flickering, ephemeral pixels of the cloud. The search for identity has become a search for the original file in a world of infinite copies. This leads us to the final, most crucial question of our masterclass. We have spent 9 parts tracing the evolution of the American man through the most turbulent transitions of his life. We have seen him use the canvas as a weapon, a shield, and a ledger. We have watched him move from the boardroom to the ranch, from the suburban garage to the digital metaverse. But what is the final synthesis? What is the ultimate lesson that 200 years of American art can teach the modern man about the potential outcomes of his own domestic journey? In the 10th and final part of this series, we bring it all together. We will reveal the unified theory of the American split. We will look at the most recent cutting-edge art of this very year 2026, and see how the newest generation of American men is finally breaking the cycle of erasure and silence. We will explore the rise of post-digital realism and the return of the physical artifact. Is it possible that the future of the American man lies not in the cloud, but in a return to the very first thing he tried to escape, the raw, unedited, and uncompromising truth of the human connection? The conclusion to our masterclass is not just a summary, it is a revelation. The final frame is about to be revealed. The revelation we have been moving toward in 2026 is that the American man has finally reached a point of visual exhaustion with erasure. After 2 centuries of scrubbing wives from canvases, hiding in the shadows of noir-inspired diners, and using AI to delete the digital fingerprints of a failed union, a new movement has emerged that historians are calling post-digital realism. This is the era of the raw, unedited, and uncompromising truth of the human connection, where the scar is no longer seen as a blemish but as the primary subject of the work. For the modern man, this represents a radical shift from the aesthetic of the split to the aesthetic of the integration. Imagine a man named Samuel in 2026. Samuel is a high-level data analyst who has just finalized a 2-year legal battle. In previous generations, a man in his position might have commissioned a solitary portrait to Project Strength, or used generative prompts to create a flawless new dating profile. But Samuel chooses something different. He participates in a movement known as the Evidence Collective. He hires an artist to create a large-scale installation using the actual physical debris of his divorce. The cardboard boxes from his move, the keys to a house he no longer owns, and the printed transcripts of his mediation sessions. This is not a work of anger. It is a work of archiving. By turning the evidence of his domestic collapse into a physical artifact, Samuel is refusing to engage in the historical trend of silence. He is making his history visible, tangible, and permanent. The data from the mid-2020s shows that this return to the physical is a direct response to the hollowness of the digital age. Historical trends indicate that as the ability to fake or alter images reached its peak with deepfake technology, the value of the authentic, unedited physical object skyrocketed. In the world of U.S. art history, this is the analog correction. We see this in a specific case study of a 2026 exhibition titled The Divided Room. The artist, a veteran of the family court system, created a series of sculptures where high-tensile steel beams were intentionally corroded with salt water. The rust was not hidden. It was highlighted with gold leaf, echoing the Japanese tradition of kintsugi, but adapted for the American masculine experience. This art argues that the man who has been through the fire of a domestic split is not a broken version of his former self, but a new, more complex structure entirely. Step by step, we can see how this new visual literacy is changing the way men navigate their reputations. In the Gilded Age, the potential outcomes of a visible divorce were social liquidation. In 2026, the potential outcomes of a hidden divorce are a loss of authentic connection. Modern men are using art to bridge this gap. They are moving away from the solitary patriarch model and toward what is being called the integrated father. We see this in the surge of genre paintings that depict the messy reality of co-parenting. These are not the sanitized Rockwellian scenes of the 1950s. They are paintings that show a father in a small apartment-sized kitchen, surrounded by half-packed bags and school schedules, but with a look of grounded, realistic presence. The art is no longer trying to sell an ideal. It is trying to document a life. A crucial case study in this transition is the work of Leo Vance, a prominent figure in the 2026 art scene. Vance's series, The Split View Landscapes, features traditional American vistas, the Grand Canyon, the Hudson River. But the canvases are literally split in half and reassembled with a gap in the middle. This gap represents the loss of the shared narrative. For the American man, looking at this work provides a sense of profound relief. It acknowledges that the world is still beautiful, but it is no longer whole in the way it once was. Vance's work has become a staple in the offices of high-end mediators and family law firms, not as decoration, but as a tool for visual empathy. It helps men understand that the fractured nature of their lives is not a failure of their character, but a feature of their journey. The depth of this shift is also evident in the way men are reclaiming the domestic space as a site of artistic production. In the 1970s, the bachelor pad was a stage for autonomy. In 2026, the home of the divorced man is a laboratory for self-discovery. We see this in the rise of the living ledger. Men are using the walls of their homes to map out their values, their goals, and their histories in a way that is both aesthetic and functional. This is a far cry from the empty, white-walled minimalism of the 2000s. These spaces are filled with textures, books, and art that reflect a man's actual interests, rather than a curated persona. The historical trend here is the death of the performative male. The American man is finally painting for an audience of one. As we look at the financial implications, the art of the split has also evolved. In the 1980s, art was a weapon for asset storage. In 2026, we see the emergence of the settlement archive. Some men are now including the commissioning of a historical record of the marriage and its end as part of their domestic agreements. They hire artists to document the transition, creating a body of work that can be shared with their children in the future. This is a form of legacy management that prioritizes emotional clarity over financial secrecy. By creating a visual record that includes both parents, the man is ensuring that the children don't inherit a smudge on a canvas, but a complete, if complicated, picture. The potential outcomes of this radical honesty are still being measured, but the early data is promising. Men who engage with the art of their own history report a higher sense of agency and a lower rate of long-term social isolation. They are no longer running from the lightning-struck tree in the background of their portrait. They are studying the wood. They are realizing that the American story has always been one of breaking and rebuilding, from the first colonies to the digital frontier. The divorce is not a footnote in their art history. It is a major movement. To truly understand this masterclass, you must look at your own life as a canvas that is constantly being overpainted. The goal is not to have a flawless, single-layer portrait. The goal is to have a work of such depth and texture that the viewer can see the history of every brushstroke. We have moved from the erasure of the 1800s to the transparency of 2026. We have moved from the solitary man to the integrated man. The final frame of this story is not a picture of a man standing alone on a hill. It is a picture of a man standing in the middle of his own complicated, beautiful and authentic life, holding the brush and deciding exactly what the next layer will be. As we conclude this deep dive, we realize that the history of divorce for men in U.S. art is actually the history of American masculinity itself. It is a story of the struggle to balance power with vulnerability and public image with private truth. But while we have unraveled the story of the split, we haven't yet looked at the story of the build. What happens when the man from the solitary landscape decides to paint a new world from scratch? How does the aesthetic of the survivor become the aesthetic of the founder? In our next series, we will explore the visual history of the American comeback, looking at how the most influential men in history used their lowest points as the primary color for their greatest masterpieces. The canvas is blank once again, and the potential for a new masterpiece is infinite. We will see you in the next deep dive into the art of the American legacy.